The fear builds. A little more than a week after the death of the Goodwoman Phillips, soon after New Year's Eve, John Grunt stepped to the door of his London shop and tossed a coin to one of the ragged boys shivering in the frosty January air outside. Run and fetch me a copy of the Bills of Mortality. The first bill of the year was printed this morning, and I'm anxious to see it. You may find me in a generous mood to repay you for your speed. As soon as he watched the boy disappear up the cobble road, John considered how surprising it was that the Bill of Mortality, a page of statistics listing the week's births and deaths in each London parish, should have become so popular with readers. Each week in the coffee houses and the taverns, conversation was sure to turn to the latest news in the bills, especially if there were any unusual deaths. John Grunt always found the Bills of Mortality fascinating. He had heard that there was something he would find particularly interesting in this week's edition. And when the errand boy ran back with the page fluttering in his hands, it didn't take long for John to spot it. Death by plague 1. London hadn't had an epidemic of plague for nearly 20 years. And plagues usually struck in the hot months of the summer, not in the midst of the coldest winter that anyone could remember. But all the same, John decided to keep a close eye on the bills over the next few months. For the rest of the cold, dark winter, while all of London was watching the sky, John was scanning the list of deaths, reading the signs there that told him an epidemic of plague was coming again. Looking for answers. As the owner of a popular haberdashery, a store selling cloths, John Grunt was an expert on everything from the corset cotton to the finest silks and velvets, along with buttons, threads, and ribbons in every color of the rainbow. But running a successful business wasn't enough to keep John's active mind occupied. He really wanted to make a name for himself in a scientist or a scholar. He'd always been fascinated with the weekly Bills of Mortality. By the late 1650s, he'd had saved several years' worth of weekly statistics. John realized that those dusty sacks held a treasure trove of information. As a businessman, he knew the value of having information about his customers. He needed to know approximately how many births to expect each year so that he could stock the right amount of delicate linens for christening robes. And by knowing how many deaths there might be in a year, he could have enough cloth for mourning clothes on hand. At the time, there was no source for his kind of data. John, like other shopkeepers, were forced to depend on his intuition and experience when ordering his stock. Yet, in 1592, the weekly Bills of Mortality had been tracking these numbers and more. By reading through the bill and adding up the deaths and births, John realized he would be able to work out annual averages and perhaps find useful patterns. He began to wonder what other uses there might be for information about births and death rates in the city. Comparing the numbers of deaths and their causes from one year to another might reveal patterns, not only in how many people were dying, but also why. John Grunt decided that he had found the perfect subject for a scientific study. What about dying of curiosity? Plague wasn't the only thing killing Londoners during the 17th century. The bill of mortality were filled with unusual ways to die. Some that you are not likely to see in the obituary included stoppage in the stomach, twisting of the guts, eaten by lice, and the mysteriously horseshoe head. Success at last. John Grunt collected the bill of mortality for the past 60 years and studied them, looking for the secrets that they held about London life. In 1662, he published his findings in a short book with a long title, Natural and Political Observations mentioned in the following index, and made upon the bill of mortality, with reference to the government, religion, trade, growth, air, disease, and the several changes of the same city. His book was an instant hit, and in 1663, John was admitted to a very exclusive club of scientists, the Royal Society of London, for improving natural knowledge. Although Johns modestly described his accomplishment as just shopkeeper's mathematics, he developed a method for predicting the arrival of a plague year. This was a tremendous scientific advantage. For more than curiosity, the people of London had suffered regular epidemics of plague, one almost every 20 years. Tens of thousands had died, and the city's inhabitants lived in fear of the next outbreak. The city's inhabitants lived in the fear of the next outbreaks. But studying the bill of mortality, John realized that in the months leading up to an outbreak of plague, deaths from all causes were higher than usual. Sickly years, he called them. In the winter of 1664 was the start of a very sickly year in London. Goodwin Phillips' death was the first one to be recorded as plague, but he was sure it wouldn't be the last. The sickly year theory. By watching the number of deaths closely and seeing as they began to rise each week, John Grunt was able to predict a plague epidemic. He looked at all deaths, not just from plague, because he knew the system for recording deaths in London wasn't very accurate. Years before, King James I had ordered each London parish, the district surrounding a church, to begin keeping track of all the local births and deaths. Officials called parish clerks were in charge of the records. Since there weren't enough clerks to track down all the births and deaths in a crowded city, they depended on searchers, like the ones who visited the Goodwin Phillips home, to collect the information they needed. This system had a few problems. For one thing, the searchers had no medical background. When it wasn't clear what someone had died from, they had to guess. This led to some unusual entries in the bills of mortality, like teeth, pinning, evil, full, etc., and found dead. In addition, the searchers weren't paid much. So for the price of a drink and a few extra pennies, many searchers would agree to write down anything they were told. When someone had died of plague, their family would be eager to bribe the searchers to cover it up. Otherwise, the whole family would be shut up in the house to prevent them from spreading plague seeds. John Grunt estimated that up to 20% of plague deaths were recorded as something else in the bill of mortality. The third problem was that parish clerks only recorded the births and death of citizens who belonged to the official religion, the Church of England. This created big gaps in the official statistics and left out other religious groups, such as Jews, Catholics, Quakers, and nonconformists. There were a few more plague deaths in London through the rest of the cold winter. And as the weather warmed up, the numbers began to increase. In the first week of June, 43 deaths from plague were recorded, as many as there had been for the whole year up to then. The next week, there were 112. By the following year, 7,000 people were dying each week. Plague had returned to London. In a vengeance, soon, anyone who could afford to leave the city began packing their bags. John Grunt stayed where he was. He had his shop to look after, but more importantly, he wanted to keep an eye on the information coming from the parishes each week. His theory about sickly years leading to plague years was being proven before his very eyes. Turn back to page 17. Blast from the past. Many people have heard of the Black Death, the pandemic of plague in the Middle Ages that killed almost a third of people in Europe. But the world was suffering through not just one, but 3 plague pandemics. The first was known as the Plague of Justinian, named after the Roman Emperor Justinian the First. The disease first broke out in the Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, Turkey, in 541 CE. It swept through the city, killing up to 5,000 people a day before going on to spread across Spain, Italy, Africa, and the Middle East. Over the next 3 years, it killed as many as 50 million people. Afterwards, plague outbreaks continued, but didn't reach pandemic levels until 1347, when traders and invading armies carried the disease into Europe. Whole villages were wiped out by the Black Death. Crops went unharvested and trade stopped. Some historians think 1/3 of the population died in the pandemic. It took 200 years for the population to recover. The next great pandemic of plague started in 1855 and lasted 100 years. Rats hiding in steamships carried the diseases across the world, causing outbreaks in port cities in every continent. Over 15 million people died. Will there be a 4th pandemic of plague? It's possible, but unlikely. Plagues can now be treated with antibiotics, and thanks to modern hygiene, many cities are cleaner with fewer rats. Turn to page 19. Tools of the trade. Descriptive epidemiology. Epidemiology is all about looking at the big picture of a disease outbreak. While physicians try to help individual patients get well, epidemiologists help to keep up from getting sick in the first place. To do this, they need to understand who is getting sick, what causes the disease, and how it is spread. Once they have this information, they can try to figure out how to stop the outbreak. Most countries today keep track of diseases with unusual cases of infectious disease. In 1665, there was a very little of this kind of information. John Grunt was the first person in England to realize that keeping accurate records of the number of people who died each year could help fight disease. His analysis of the bill of mortality from 1664 and 1665 is one of the earliest examples of what we now call descriptive epidemiology. It is the first step in putting together the big picture of disease outbreak. For an epidemiologist, putting together the big picture means using data, lots of it, to describe the who, what, when, and where of the outbreak. The answer to these questions are clues to how and why the epidemic is spreading information that they can use to fight the disease. Now turn to page 23. Grant's legacy. John Grant discovered that plague years were preceded by sickly years, was a huge step forward in tracking diseases. His recommendation that doctors and health officials pay close attention to all unexplained increase in deaths rates is still helping epidemiologists pinpoint and stop disease outbreaks today. It was only after the Spanish influenza pandemic in the early 2000th century that investigator Wade Hampton Frost realized the rates of pneumonia had been unusually high in the months leading up to the massive outbreak of the flu in the US Army camps. Looking back, Wade suspected that what doctors had been calling pneumonia had really been early cases of the Spanish influenza. If someone had remembered the lesson of John Grant and looked into the sudden jump in pneumonia cases, it might have led to an early identification of the illness. The Spanish flu swept through the United States before going global and killing millions worldwide in the winter of 1918. In 2019, when the doctors of Wuhan, China, noticed more pneumonia cases than usual, they were quick to let the authorities know, hoping to avert another pandemic. But the virus had a head start.